Hello and welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. This is Benji, and today we'll be talking about 5 tips that we can do during the standby phase. Now, there are tips for either player's turn. There's tips for your standby phase, and there's tips for your opponent's standby phase. So we're going to be starting off by talking about some tips that you can use during your own standby phase before your main phase. And one of the things you need to know is that there's a lot of cards in the game currently that your opponent will set as interrupts on your turn, and some of those cards include Flaunderies in the Dreaming Town, or Prank Kids Pandemonium, which are the interruptions that are set up by their turn 1 combos. There's also like Shadal Schism. You can like set up any of the synchro on your turn opponent's cards, like Hopier Squadron, things like that. A lot of those cards can be dealt with by simply activating a Twin Twister during your own standby phase to destroy your opponent's set cards. So you can destroy Pandemonium, you can destroy Flaunderies in the Dreaming Town, you can also destroy like Shadal Schism. That way they can't be activated during your main phase because they all have a restriction that says they can only be used during the main phase. Similarly, if they had like a Synchro Tuner or a Halka Fibrax, you can always imperm them during the standby phase so that they don't get to the main phase where they can actually use those effects. All right, next we're going to talk about things that you can do before your opponent's main phase, and things you should consider doing are things like Artifact LANCEA. If you activate Artifact LANCEA during your opponent's standby phase, you avoid them being able to use things like Pot of Prosperity or Pot of Extravagance, or any card that they might require for them to banish cards from their deck. Maybe Pot of Desires. You'll notice I mentioned every pot in the game all seem to banish cards. But that's a reason to fire these cards off early, either in the draw phase or the standby phase. You just want to get them in before their main phase. So again, most important part of the standby phase is it is before the main phase. Now, doing this will play into things like Gamma, but sometimes you just have to play into Gamma. It depends on the decks you're playing against. If you know you're playing against DRYTRON, they're not going to be playing Cyframe Gear Gamma, and you don't have to worry about that. So Cyframe Gear Gamma might stop you from resolving your Dimension Shifter or your Lancea, but not in the matchup. So if you know your matchups, you'll know if your opponent's playing Cyframe Gear Gamma. If you there are other cards you might want to resolve during your opponent's standby phase, or draw phase, like Abyss Dweller, things like that, which you might hold off on until their main phase, because well, you should do it. You could do them in the standby phase so that you could play around like things like Triple Tactics Talents, but you could also do them in the main phase. But by going to the main phase, you actually play into a bunch of main phase 1 cards that are kind of hard to play around. So if you have like an Abyss Dweller, it can lose to a Dark Ruler. If you have like Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer on board with a set Artifact Scythe that plays into Dark Ruler, when you can just resolve those effects and those combos during the standby phase. Other cards you might run into would be things like Raigeki or Kaijus. Amano Owato is a normal summon. They can just normal summon a barrier statue. Maybe your play requires you to special summon something. So activating a lot of your cards in your opponent's standby phase or the draw phase would be good ways to avoid them countering you with cards that you may or may not have planned for. Again, knowing matchups will help you determine whether or not you should be doing one thing or the other. Like if you know your opponent's on Imperm, one of the things people like to do is to hold their quick effect Abyss Dweller until the main phase in the hopes that their opponent will like normal summon a monster first. That way they can't activate an Imperm. But a lot of people are on Droplet now, so that might not be a safe play. Other cards you might want to activate during the standby phase of your opponent's turn, or even in their main phase, would be something like Anti-Spell Fragrance, because if you wait till the main phase, they might just have Harpy's Feather Duster and just destroy it, and they have priority in the main phase. So there's no reason to let them get access to a whole bunch of powerful cards that they can activate with priority during their main phase. If you can just flip this card over early. If they have the out for it, then they have the out for it. You know, sometimes you can't control anything. So next I want to talk about some cards and getting maximum value out of them. There are a couple. I'm just going to use a few examples. First is Time Thieves. So if you actually play a Time Thief deck and you have Time Thief Redoer, you can have it banish itself from the field until the end phase by detaching a monster as part of its effect, putting a monster in the graveyard for your Time Thief Perpetua. So if you have these 2 cards and Perpetua's effect to revive a Time Thief can only be used in the standby phase, you could resolve Redoer with the intention of putting a Time Thief in grave so that it can actually summon something. So that's a cool play to know that you have some cards that can only be used during a certain phase, so you can use your other cards to kind of play around that. Like I do that in Infernoids with a certain combo where I send one of my monsters to the graveyard, and then if they called by, I have a card that can be used during a standby phase to add a card back to my hand, but it can only be used during a standby phase. So like Time Thief Perpetua, Void Purification, they're cards that can only be used during a standby phase. So if you can combo your cards in such a way to resolve them like that, you get maximum value. Like perhaps with like Baronne de Fleur. Let's say you have an Abyss Dweller on the field and you have your Baronne, and your opponent hasn't tried an effect on it yet, and you haven't used your negate with your Baronne de Fleur. one of the things you can do is you can activate your Dweller and see if your opponent tries to negate it. And if they do, you can use your negate for your Baron. And then since it's still the standby phase, you can activate the effect of Baron to have it return to the extra deck to summon a level 9 or lower monster from your graveyard, giving you the value of the special summon effect of Baron while also achieving the negate. So you can try and force your opponent to use a card and then be able to use the negate while also being able to tag out into another monster during the standby phase. Next up, I want to talk about priority. Now, in the priority, it follows the fast effects timing chart. I'll bring that up at the end of the video, but things to know is if you and your opponent both have a Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer that are currently in the graveyard and they've both activated effects, they both activated their effect and you're both going to be able to special summon a Destiny Hero during the standby phase, whoever's turn player has priority. So your options for when you have priority are that you can resolve an effect, you can activate a quick effect, or you can pass priority to your opponent. And after you resolve an effect or activate a quick effect, your opponent's only response to those is to activate a quick effect. Or they can respond to those with a quick effect, but you also get priority each time. So if you resolve an effect, you can activate a quick effect or pass priority to them. And if you activate a quick effect, they can respond to a quick effect. So let's say you have an Enforcer that's in the graveyard and so do they. What you can start your turn off with is maybe a Widow Anchor instead of resolving your Destroyer. So you can Widow Anchor your opponent's Baron, which was probably there to negate a play. Then you can actually resolve your Destroyer. So you can bring your Destroyer back, and then you can have your Destroyer pop their card. So you can activate your Destroyer in the standby phase before they resummon their Destroyer, pop their set card, and activate your Destroyer again. And then before you even let them get the opportunity to summon their own Destroyer back, you can then activate a Shark Cannon. And you can do all this before they summon their Destroyer because it's your turn, and the time in which they would revive their monster is at the end of the standby phase after you've passed priority to them and determined that you're not activating any quick effects or resolving any other lingering effects. All right, so next I have a couple of general tips for the standby phase. These are just things that happen because of the way certain cards work. One of them would be like Dark Contract with the Gates. The DDD cards have these Dark Contracts which require them to take effect damage. So during the standby phase, they might have to take 1,000 damage from either Dark Contract with the Gate or Dark Contract with the Swamp King, depending on how many are there. You could potentially just win the game by your opponent burning themselves if you can get them to leave their cards on the field, prevent them from getting rid of them. So you can try and get your opponent down to 2,000 life points if they have 2 Dark Contracts, and maybe they'll end the game for you, which is kind of nice. Next is a cool combo that works against Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer using DD Crow. If your opponent is on DRYTRON, you can activate DD Crow during your standby phase with priority to banish their card before they're allowed to revive it. You just banish their Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, and then because the DRYTRONs have a restriction on them that says you can't special summon monsters that can be normal summoned that turn, if they're playing a Destiny Hero that can be normal summoned as part of their fusion package for Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, usually people play Destiny Hero Celestial, they'll be forced to summon it, or their Dasher, and as soon as they do, the DRYTRONs can't be activated for the rest of the turn. So it's a cool combo in the standby phase. You might want to use it in the draw phase, though, if it's on your opponent's turn, because they'll have priority, and then if you wait to the standby phase, they have priority, and they can just summon their Destroyer, and then you miss the opportunity to DD Crow. So that's a cool play. So do note that when it is your turn, you have priority in the standby phase, but if you can do the play in the draw phase, you might want to consider that. During their turn, they have priority in the standby phase, and if you wait till then, you might have missed your opportunities. Let's see. This is the fast effects timing chart, just for clarification on what I was saying. When the phase starts, you start in the open game state, and then there's 2 things you can do. You can either take an action that does not start a chain, which would be reviving your Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, or you can activate a card. Now, if you activate a card, chain rules apply, but you'll notice that chain rules don't include things like them resolving their Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer. So after the chain resolves, it returns to the open game state, which is not the place where your opponent would resolve their Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer. The place that your opponent resolves Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, if it's your turn during the standby phase, is box E. So that's if you choose to not do anything. That's the last box there. It says turn player passes priority. Then your opponent can activate fast effects. It's not actually limited to fast effects. It's just that there are things that have to be done in the standby phase. They can't do anything until then. So I hope this has been helpful. Make sure you check out the video up above. It should be 5 tips in the draw phase. And if you look at the playlist over here, I have a lot of videos on rulings. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you like what you see, and maybe you'll see you in the next video on the main phase.